When fought at scale, conventional war can be an all-encompassing test of a nation's resources and will. The war in Ukraine is no different. Last week I covered the economic aspect of the struggle, the energy war, production efforts, budgets and opinion polls. But while foreign powers try to develop better sanctions or mobilise industrial potential, the war itself, the grim business of combat between opposing armies, has continued through the winter. There, after a comparative lull in activity towards the end of last year, Russia has renewed its attacks on Ukrainian positions, grinding away at Ukrainian positions and trying to recapture some of the momentum that the Russian army lost with Ukrainian victories at Kharkiv and Kherson in late 2022. Now, with the winter weather beginning to retreat, giving way to the spring, I thought it was time to have a look at the developments on the battlefield and ask the question, how much has Russia's second great winter offensive achieved? And what might it mean for the rest of 2023? So what am I going to be covering? Well, first I'm going to give some background to the Russian winter offensive. Then I'm going to walk through the major battlefields, particularly those in Luhansk and Donetsk. This won't be a detailed day-by-day analysis of who has seized what terrain feature. There are plenty of other channels that cover that. Instead, I'm going to take a pretty broad look at the events that we've seen over winter at places like Avdiivka or Bakhmut or Vuhledar. Then, based on the way those battles have evolved, I'm going to make some general observations, look at some of the evolving tactics that we've seen from both sides, and ask the broad question, as of the middle of March, what has the Russian offensive achieved, other than significantly simplifying the Wagner Group payroll? That said, one thing I won't be focusing on this week is estimating attrition, casualties, and force regeneration. Instead, with an acknowledgement of the very, very deep limits of information gathering through the fog of war, we're going to focus on how the offensives have played out, what lessons might be learned, and what it might mean for the campaigns to come. But before I do, let me welcome back returning sponsor, Ground News. In deciding what stories to cover and how to cover them, the media has a role in shaping public opinion on the war in Ukraine. When Ron DeSantis recently stated that Ukraine wasn't a vital national interest for the United States, most networks covered it, although the slant of the story differed. But when it came to follow-up stories, the information space began to diverge. Democrat Chuck Schumer's response to DeSantis' statement, or indeed criticisms of DeSantis from within the Republican Party, were comparative blind spots for some networks Ground News identifies as right-wing. On the flip side, Max Gates' effort to blockade Ukraine was a blind spot in the other direction. That sort of lopsided coverage can shape the ongoing polarization of public opinion, and given time may impact how this war ends. Echo chambers can be dangerous, and Ground News website and app allows you to see diverse reporting coverage, political headlines, and ownership details. I respect what they're trying to do, and it's why I've been so happy to feature them on the channel. I'd encourage you to try them out. They do offer a free service, but if you'd like to jump right into a premium membership, you can get 30% off by going to ground.news/Perun or clicking on a link in the description. So to understand what's happened over the winter months, I think we need to go back just a little bit further to the last pre-winter month of 2022. Back in November, Ukraine had just liberated Kherson, the only regional capital that Russia had managed to take during the initial stages of its invasion. That Ukrainian victory followed the appointment of a new Russian commander in October, Sergei Surovikin, and it appears to have been Surovikin who looked at the tough, expensive defensive campaign that Russia was waging, trying to hold the Ukrainians back from Kherson, and ultimately advocated for withdrawal. In a military sense, it probably helped Russia preserve some valuable military capacity in the form of airborne units that were fighting to defend the Kherson perimeter. But in a political sense, the liberation of Kherson was a massive morale boost for the Ukrainian cause, both domestically and around the world. The fact that the Russian withdrawal from Kherson generally seems to have been planned in advance and relatively well executed didn't take away from the fact that it was only done because of Ukrainian military pressure, and that while Ukrainian forces no doubt suffered from attrition and exhaustion, the Russian military had now been very visibly defeated both at Kharkiv and Kherson. It was on the basis of those defeats that many external commentators made their projections for how the war would go over winter. Many, including myself, predicted that Ukraine would try and keep up the pressure at least somewhere along the line, while Russia focused on reconstituting and rebuilding its forces for future actions. Russia had personnel coming in as a result of partial mobilization. It had equipment that it could pull out of storage. It had new units that it could organize and ready. On most parts of the line, with the exception of places like Bakhmut, the Russians largely went over onto the defensive. The missile campaign aimed at Ukrainian critical infrastructure ramped up in its place, and Ukraine retained the initiative along parts of the front. Russian efforts to build new fixed fortifications, in some cases well behind the lines or even on Russian territory itself, accelerated. Some Russian commentators took to somewhat mockingly calling this the Surovikin line. While on the comparative safety of the internet, some would ask the question of if the special military operation was going according to plan, why were these new modern art installations required in places like Crimea or Belgorod? Perhaps the most confusing of these defensive preparations was the creation of trenches and earthworks in Crimea, and not on the Perekop Isthmus, the part of Crimea facing the rest of Ukraine, but on beaches facing towards the Black Sea. Whether anyone at a Russian planning meeting asked the question of how Ukraine, with its comparative lack of any surface-going fleet or amphibious warfare capability, might be expected to successfully pull off an amphibious invasion of Crimea is still unfortunately unknown to us. But they do suggest at least some permeation of a defensive mindset among some in the Russian leadership. And so the early winter months proceeded largely as many had predicted. Wagner Group and the Russian military maintained pressure on Bakhmut, but elsewhere at places like Kreminna, the Ukrainians were the ones applying pressure and making small biting advances. Russian force reconstitution efforts proceeded apace, and the missile campaign reached something of a crescendo. Surovikin seems to have been happy to take a patient, grinding approach, striking out against the Ukrainian economy, but taking the time to rebuild his tired force and to better leverage Russia's theoretically larger reserves of manpower and materiel. Now, evaluating Kremlin maneuvering and Russian strategic planning through the veil of the fog of war is difficult at the best of times. But with the limited information in open source, Surovikin's plan broadly seems to make sense. Russian visually confirmed losses fell off. Fewer forces were now being wasted in attacks that showed no results, or holding positions that were overly exposed and difficult to resupply. You could argue that many of the defeats that Russia suffered in 2022 were because of a disconnect between the military means available to it and the scope of its political objectives. Attacking Ukraine in the way it had, trying to take over a country the size of Ukraine with the limited resources available to it, just simply wasn't militarily practical, no matter how much it was what the politicians, and in particular what Putin, demanded. Now Surovikin appears to have adopted a strategy that was more within the limited means available to the Russian military. Then, perhaps because acknowledging objective reality is just not the done thing in the Russian armed forces, just a few months after his original appointment, Surovikin was replaced. His replacement was Chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. Now, by virtue of his position, it's almost certain that Gerasimov was one of the individuals involved in planning the initial Russian operation to attack Ukraine in February 2022. All of the wishful thinking and poor planning that went into that particular operation likely has his fingerprints on it. But many of the reigning theories in the West suggest that Gerasimov was able to convince Putin that Surovikin was being too conservative. Sure, going onto the defensive might make military sense, but it wasn't going to secure the Kremlin's political objectives. And so despite the fact that this whole thing had started with an overly ambitious, multi-pronged winter offensive against the Ukrainians, Gerasimov's appointment does seem to correlate with another overly ambitious, multi-pronged winter assault against the Ukrainians. Russian forces weren't going to sit and absorb Ukrainian pressure, they were going on the attack. Now, not all elements of Surovikin's time in command were erased. The strategic bombing campaign would continue, as would fortification efforts. But Gerasimov's appointment would also be followed pretty promptly by a series of ground offensives. These would draw in some of Russia's more capable units, the remaining paratroopers, marine infantry, and Wagner's assault troops. While for their part, the Ukrainian High Command, and this is a gross oversimplification, appear to have been willing to switch over to primarily defensive operations. Perhaps unsurprising, given that generally speaking in military affairs, attacking is a far more demanding activity than defending. Which brings us to the details of the Russian winter offensive itself. At a zoomed out level, I think there's a lot of insights we might be able to take out of observing this offensive. And before we get into it, I want to answer one potentially quite strange question. That is whether an offensive has happened at all. Because even, I would argue, some time after the Russian offensive kicked off, there were those in the media that were still genuinely asking the question of whether or not an offensive had actually started. Now, generally speaking, if the other side can't tell whether your offensive has gone in or not, that's pretty embarrassing. But I suspect that part of the reason people were asking this question was because expectations had become somewhat skewed. Ukrainian leaders had talked about a grand Russian army being prepared beyond the Ural Mountains to be used in some great new offensive. And many in the media seem to have suspected that if a Russian offensive came, it would look something like what we saw on 24 February 2022. A massed movement of armoured columns that would punch a hole in Ukrainian lines and strike deep into operational depths. Or maybe they expected Russia to gather many of its forces together and stage at least a local armoured breakthrough. And if they couldn't see that, or they couldn't see any grand announcement from the Kremlin, well, then the offensive wasn't on. For my part, I think the evidence makes pretty clear that the Russians were attacking. What's more, they were attacking quite heavily at multiple locations along the front line. Soon after Gerasimov's appointment and the switch of Russian forces over to a more aggressive stance, Russian visually confirmed loss data began to spike. The graph in front of you shows approximate Oryx visually confirmed loss data for a range of classes of Russian equipment up to the 9th of the months of January, February and March. Why the 9th? Because Gerasimov was appointed on the 11th, which allows us to broadly see that in the last month before Gerasimov took over, there were 154 losses in the vehicle categories we're looking at. In the month immediately following, that number spiked to 283 and then 267. That suggests the kind of uptick in military activity that you would associate with offensive action. There's also the fact that Russian forces were openly talking about the offensive and Ukrainian forces were corroborating it. Official claims of opposing casualties on both sides dramatically escalated, and it was clear Russian units were attempting to seize territory. But where, why, and to what effect? Of those questions, the what is probably the easiest to answer. The Russian offensive didn't look like a single red arrow on the map drawn by a Hearts of Iron player towards the opposing capital. There was going to be no Control-A attack move Kyiv maneuver this time. Instead, observers identified multiple axes of attempted advance all along the line of contact in the Donbass aimed at specific objectives. Some of those places are probably already very familiar to those of you listening, places like Bakhmut or Avdiivka. The why is harder to discern, at least unless you've managed to get an invitation to a planning meeting at the Russian General Staff. Foreign observers have made a series of guesses. Colonel Viktor Kevliuk, for example, of the Ukrainian Center for Defense Strategies, hypothesized the intention of the Russian offensive was as follows: to launch local offensive actions against Kupyansk, Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka, and some other locations to identify weak areas in Ukrainian defenses, force the Ukrainian military to spend resources, deploy reserves, and then create the conditions for the capture of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, which would in some second stage have to inevitably include the capture of both Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Taking all of the Donbass simply isn't feasible as long as those frontline towns and cities remain unconquered. So conquered they would have to be. So with the theory of the why and the what now in hand, the last question remains: how did it go? And for that, I think it's best to look at each battle somewhat individually. And before I do, I want to provide a sense of perspective. Because when we're talking about local offensives here, we genuinely mean local offensives. On the left there, you have the deep state map of approximate military control, with red being Russia or Russia-aligned forces, as of the 1st of December 2022. On the right, you have the same map from March, 3 months later. Now, a lot of coverage of the Russian winter offensive uses language like breakthrough or Russian advances, and often the magic of the mouse wheel is exploited to zoom in on an area close enough that an advance truly looks threatening or at a large scale. But despite fierce fighting that has killed or wounded tens of thousands of servicemen and women over the course of the winter offensive, the reality is the lines have barely moved. And I would usually caution in general about over-focusing on territory as a measure of success. I think it's something we tend to do because it's very visible, it's very easy to check. Anyone can open up Deep State Map, ask which way the line is moving, and conclude that whichever side is moving the line in their direction is obviously winning. And what that obviously misses is everything else that goes into fighting and winning a war. What is the political support of the population? What is the economic situation? What is the condition and the trend of the two forces involved? Who's getting weaker? Who's getting stronger? That's not to say territory capture doesn't matter. If the Russians were able to raise their flag in Kyiv, that would matter. That would have a significant impact on the war, even if it wouldn't end it. But at this scale of change, it's hard to argue that territory is the decisive factor. World War I wasn't won by the Entente grinding through the trenches a couple of yards at a time. It was won by the political, economic and military collapse of the primary combatants on one side. But to indulge in the territorial measure for just a moment, I've thrown up a graph produced by WarMapper on Twitter, which I think illustrates the point relatively well. In January and February of 2023, the Russian winter offensive has seized approximately 0.11% of Ukraine's territory, meaning that if they continued at this rate for the next 2.5 years approximately, they would undo the Ukrainian gains from September. Prigozhin was criticised by some on the Russian side for suggesting it might take a year and a half to conquer the Donbass, but even that probably overstates the pace of recent Russian advances, especially when he starts talking about it only taking 2 years to take all of eastern Ukraine. At those kind of rates, it would take Russia far more than a century to conquer Ukraine's remaining territory, which is the kind of timescale where you can start writing spaceships and orbital bombardment assets into forward operational planning. I say this not to minimise the scale of the offensive. As we were about to see, it was immensely costly for both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and the fall of some of these targeted locations would have domestic and international significance. But I thought it was important to put some moderation around some of the language and reporting that we see. With all that said, let's have a look at some of the individual battles. And the first thing to say is that all these battlefields are not like each other. If you hear an anecdote or a story from one unit fighting on a particular front, it can be really dangerous to extrapolate that out to all the others, because each of these are different locations fought by different units in different ways and in different conditions. Nor just because a location isn't a target of the Russian offensive does that mean that there's no fighting going on there. Kherson, for example, is still seeing active combat, even if it's not a current Russian objective. But this probably owes a lot to the fact that after the Russians withdrew from the city, well, now there's a river in between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Given the defensive barrier that river provides, both sides stripped a lot of their forces away from this sector to move to other fronts. A Russian offensive in this sector was made even less likely by the logistical situation. The Ukraine-held bank is generally the higher one, and a railroad runs all the way to Kherson, enabling Ukrainian logistics. But as this map from mid-February by Twitter user Gemini of the West makes clear, not being an active offensive target doesn't mean an area is denuded of military units or of fighting. But because of the comparatively low density of forces and the fact there's a river present, well, fighting in Kherson looks very different from elsewhere. Features include things like special forces or drone raids fought across the river, and a constant back-and-forth artillery duel. Kherson itself is regularly hit by Russian shells or rockets, while what Ukrainian footage we get of the Kherson region tends to be of long-range point shooting of drone-corrected artillery against individual hard targets, meaning anecdotes or reports from this region probably don't have much relevance to actions around, for example, Bakhmut, where the conditions and style of fighting are considerably different. So let's look at the smaller of the two Russian offensive efforts first, those in Luhansk. And here I want to focus on two primary directions of effort, in the north towards the city of Kupyansk, and further south towards the town of Liman by way of Zarychne. All of those are locations that were lost during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and notably most sit beyond the river you see in the middle of the image, the Oskil. During the Kharkiv offensive, there was an attempt by Russian forces to reset their defensive lines along the Oskil River, an effort that ultimately failed. And there are a variety of reasons the Russians might want to set conditions for further offensive actions by pushing back to the Oskil River once again. Whether that's to threaten Secedes and Slovyansk in the south, or to threaten a movement on a larger scale back into Kharkiv Oblast. In the southern part of Luhansk, the Russians would be pushing back against areas that Ukraine had until relatively recently been attacking. Now, unit identification is difficult at the best of times, but open sources have pointed to the presence of at least some Russian Guards units in the area, along with some specialised equipment, like the BMP-T. For those pushing west, one of the initial objectives would be Zarychne, a village with a pre-war population of about 2,300 people. Only then, realistically, can consideration be given for pushing on to Liman. With Liman itself being significant because any future plan to assault Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, something you have to do if you want to take all of Donetsk, would benefit greatly from holding Liman. But despite sometimes vicious fighting, as at time of recording, the Russians have made it, perhaps, halfway to Zarychne from their start line. Again, whenever I flash up these before and after photos, unless otherwise advised, the one on the left is going to be from the start of December, and the one on the right from March. Some territory has been gained in the forest in the southeast of the shot, but overall the pace of advance has oscillated between a crawl and non-existent. The fighting around Kupyansk has been so static that it doesn't even merit a before and after map shot. Make no mistake, the area has seen some vicious local attacks and counterattacks, but overall the line has barely moved. Russian forces have been able to keep Ukrainian units in their positions, fixed in place, but other than that, gains in this direction have been minimal. But to be fair to the Russian offensive, comparatively more of their effort has not been concentrated in Luhansk, but further south, in Donetsk. It's widely assessed, and hopefully not too controversial to say, that the capture of Donetsk is part of Russia's core war goals. In the list of justifications for the February 2022 invasion, the Russians listed the recognition and protection of the so-called DPR. And later on, despite saying the war explicitly wasn't a land grab, they claimed to annex the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk. But grabbing land on paper and grabbing land in fact are two very different things. And whereas Russia controls the vast majority of Luhansk territory, there's an awful lot of Donetsk still in Ukrainian hands. And so there's a lot of reason for Russia to focus offensive effort in this region. On one hand, there's the political, the desire to take all of Donetsk, and on the other, the simple fact that this area from a logistic perspective is one of the easier ones for Russia to resupply. Those factors and others help explain why fighting in this area has been continuous almost throughout the entire war, and why several settlements in this region are now well known to an international audience, places like Avdiivka, Marinka, Bakhmut, or Vuhledar. I wanted to start with Avdiivka because Bakhmut gets all of the media attention. Avdiivka briefly fell to separatist forces in April 2014, but was retaken in July of that year and has been held by Ukraine ever since. The image on the right should bring home exactly where Avdiivka is positioned. That urban agglomeration to the south is the city of Donetsk proper, which has been controlled by Russian-backed proxies since 2014. That purple coloration actually marks the territory that Russia controlled at February 24th, 2022, basically the start line of the invasion. Meaning Avdiivka started this invasion in the bizarre position of being within artillery range of an enemy city. And yet, nearly 13 months on, there it stands. To put that in perspective, imagine if the United States invaded Mexico and 13 months after the invasion commenced, Tijuana still stood strong. Although in this scenario, Tijuana is not a great city of millions of people, but instead a home to maybe 20 or 30,000 residents. Part of the reason for Avdiivka's endurance has been the fact that the city was very heavily fortified between 2014 and 2022. At this point, according to its Ukrainian governor, the city itself has been almost entirely destroyed. And yet, despite crushing artillery and numerical superiority, there have been no successful attempts to storm Avdiivka itself. Instead, Russian forces have spent months trying to slowly encircle the city. Over the past several months, some small gains were achieved. The pincers did extend towards Krasnohorovka in the north and past Vuhledar in the south. But a number of Russian sources note that defences have been built behind the city of Avdiivka and cast doubt on the ability of the forces in the area to actually close the noose. Despite being literally on the start line of the Russian invasion, and despite still being in very obvious danger, it looks like Avdiivka has survived its second winter of the war, as has Marinka further to the south, although only if you take a very generous interpretation of the word survived. The image on the right isn't Photoshop. That is what Marinka currently looks like. This is another settlement that was basically on the start line for the Russian invasion that's been holding out more or less since that time. Fighting for Marinka began in March of 2022, and the Russian MOD claimed its capture that very month. Whether out of error or overconfidence, we'll probably never know. Because 9 months after that point, the leader of the DPR, Denis Pushilin, said that Marinka would be captured soon. The fighting in Marinka differs from that in other areas because some of it takes place within the contested city itself, basically amongst the ruins and the rubble. This isn't even fighting that takes place room to room or house to house. There are no houses, there are no rooms in much of this territory. Instead, this is often very close-range fighting fought between infantry units, basement to basement, or clump of rubble to clump of rubble. Every now and again, we will see a video of an IFV or a tank pushing down a street to try its luck, a brave act that often doesn't end well for the vehicle in question. And just that one image should give you a clue as to how much artillery ammunition this place has absorbed. And yet, in more than 3 months of fighting, the totality of the recognised Russian advance is a couple of blocks pushing up towards the main street dividing the town, with even that being questioned by some. As with Avdiivka, there are signs of a Russian attempt to encircle the city. But when it comes to encirclements, a 50% effort isn't really good enough. And as at time of recording, Marinka remains untaken. Occasionally I will see people in my comment section suggesting that Ukrainian morale is close to imminent collapse. When I see those comments, Marinka is one of the places I think of, because planting your flag amongst the rubble and refusing to budge is not a behaviour usually associated with those who have given up the will to fight. Then there's the battle that has consumed the attention of the entire world. It's a battle I have talked about before. The battle for a city with a pre-war population of just over 70,000, the city of Bakhmut. It's hard to set a start date on the battle for Bakhmut, but at the very least it probably goes back to August of 2022. In December of 2022, I did a video on this topic, and so I'm going to take some of the background from that video as a given. Now make no mistake about it, even as far back as December of 2022, the battle had already taken on the characteristics of a meat grinder, drawing in men and material from both sides and causing immense numbers of casualties. But despite the significant losses being inflicted on the Ukrainian defenders, the preponderance of the evidence I've seen suggests that the battle highly favoured Ukraine at the very least through 2022 and early 2023. I'll explore the data around those potential losses more in a future video. But the reality was that even with artillery superiority, the demands of attacking an entrenched position like Bakhmut head-on, something Igor Girkin often described as smashing one's forehead into the teeth of enemy defences, meant that it was almost certainly the Russians getting the worst end of the exchange, at least from the perspective of the harsh and unfeeling arithmetic of war. But conditions in Bakhmut would deteriorate over time, particularly after the fall of the mining town of Vuhledar to the Wagner Group. You see, Bakhmut itself was standing strong, resisting every assault, but the flanks were not so lucky. On its northern and southern flanks, the Russians would slowly grind forward towards an encirclement of the city, and as at time of recording, the town itself is partly enveloped. The Russians control ground both to the north and the south, and the supply lines into the city are under constant artillery fire and attacking pressure. When the military analyst Michael Kaufman went and physically visited Bakhmut recently, he reflected that the exchange ratio between Ukrainian defenders and Russian attackers had likely narrowed. Defenders in the city were now taking fire from 3 directions. Supply was likely to become increasingly difficult, and there was a chorus of advice from Western commentators for the Ukrainians to pull out from the city. General Secedes, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, would visit the city twice, once in late February and once in early March. And following those visits, Ukraine confirmed to the world its original decision. It would defend Bakhmut. The Ukrainians, by most reports, fell back from the eastern side of the city. They blew a number of bridges where possible, and the number of Ukrainians in the city itself reportedly declined significantly, a move which makes sense given the difficulties supplying those that remain. But remain they did as March dragged on. Bakhmut, or at least part of it, remained in Ukrainian hands, fighting on. As at time of recording, there's evidence that both sides at Bakhmut are at their very limits. Ukrainian media have carried stories of shell shortages for the defenders, something that may be a product of ammunition being put aside for future offensives, a general shell shortage, or just the logistical difficulty of pushing ammunition into Bakhmut. You will hear anecdotes, for example, of mortar teams that are given an allocation of 10 bombs per day, while other stories attest that some of the replacements sent to buoy the units defending Bakhmut include troops with only a few weeks' training that have been rapidly pulled together and pushed into action. Casualties among the defenders are high, but many of the attacking Russian units appear to be in abysmal shape too. Russian commentators and Wagner Group leader Prigozhin complain of ammunition shortages, the danger of upcoming flank attacks from the Ukrainians, and then there are the estimated tens of thousands of casualties incurred by the attacking units. And it's not just Wagner prisoner recruits, it's Wagner assault teams, it's Russian airborne infantry. It appears to be some of the best that Russia has, matched in turn against some units on Ukraine's side of great renown. And at time of recording, it remains to be seen exactly how and when it will end. Ukrainian forces in the city have been drawn down but haven't left entirely. Fighting on the flanks is fierce, and the pace of Russian advances, already glacial, has slowed even further. And that slow pace of advance leads to a somewhat surreal environment. As one Ukrainian I spoke to put it, it's only a 20-minute drive from the trenches to somewhere that you can get a pizza. I heard a story of a tank commander pulling up at a gas station, jumping out, getting himself a coffee and a burger, jumping back in his tank and driving on in the direction of Bakhmut. I bring up these kind of examples and focus on the human tragedy involved because I'm aware that otherwise my mode of analysis can sometimes seem very cold. It's a study of war as inputs and outputs, as the expenditure of resources. But in Bakhmut, one of the key resources involved are people, and I don't want any of us to ever forget that. As for what happens now, or whether or not Ukraine should have withdrawn, it's hard to say. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like Ukraine has defensible locations just to the west of the city that it could fall back to and restore something like a positive exchange ratio. But when it comes to the decision to stay, it's hard to know whether it's driven by military logic, political imperatives, or some mixture of both. I've often heard people debate the strategic significance of the city. Is the city important, or are people fighting over something with no real value? As unsatisfying as it is, the answer is probably both. Intrinsically, by itself, Bakhmut has some value as a transportation hub, but it's certainly not unique in that regard. And if Russia takes it tomorrow, they will not hold in their hands an object of particularly great strategic significance. But the fact that both sides have committed such resources to the fight over this city have given it a significance all of its own. Global opinion, attrition, resource expenditure, all these things are critical elements to how this war proceeds. And Bakhmut is critical to all of them. And of all the battles the Ukrainians are currently fighting, it's this one at Bakhmut that is probably the bloodiest and most difficult. The same probably can't be said for the battles at Vuhledar, which is the last sector relevant to the Russian winter offensive we'll cover today, and probably a battle the Ukrainians wish that they could repeat month after month. From a military perspective, this is a coal mining town that sits on high grounds and thus dominates a significant amount of surrounding territory. If the Russians could take it, there would be opportunities for further offensive actions. On the political side, while we cannot know for sure, there are some suggestions out there that Vuhledar was meant to be an opportunity for the Russian regular military to win a victory to counterbalance the advances being made by Wagner Group in around the city of Bakhmut. The force Russia brought together to attack this town included some ostensibly elite units. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, which had taken significant casualties only months earlier, taking Avdiivka, which is actually just to the south of Vuhledar, had by this point apparently received many more mobilised personnel to be brought back to strength and was to be thrown into the attack, alongside a range of other units, including the 40th Naval Infantry and a unit of GRU Spetsnaz. In other words, despite the fact that some of these units had received a significant number of mobilised personnel to bring them back up to full strength, these were not some penal units brought into Wagner straight from prison. These military units were given the enviable military task of assaulting a fortified position on higher elevation across open terrain. The initial assault could be a subject of its own video, but in summary, it took some ground but overall fell to disaster. With the fields on the approach to Vuhledar having been heavily mined, the Russian attacking force was forced to primarily move by road, accompanied by mine-clearing equipment where the threat wasn't so great. Some Russian units would make it as far as a cluster of houses just to the east of Vuhledar before being pushed back by Ukrainian defenders and by artillery fire. But elsewhere, drone footage caught sight of armoured columns being stopped in their tracks. Ukrainian ATGM teams would take out the lead and rear vehicle in a particular formation. If the vehicles in between remained static, they would be destroyed by artillery. If they attempted to manoeuvre by going off-road, then they would hit mines. And where Russian forces attempted to clear a path through the minefield before advancing again in the future, the Ukrainians are reported to have used artillery-deployed mines to replace those that were cleared to ensure that future assaults failed. The drone footage of some of these attacks is harrowing, and again, I'd encourage you only look at it if you have a particularly strong stomach. At a micro level, it appears that at least some of the vehicle crews suffered from inexperience or potential panic, and at a macro level, it's clear that neither the primary assault nor any of the attempted outflanking maneuvers to the east were successful. Despite being firmly on the Russian side, Strelkov described the casualties of the entire affair as largely unilateral, saying that the Ukrainians had knocked down Russian forces like they were at a shooting gallery. Among the Russian casualties reportedly was Colonel Sergei Polyakov, commanding the GRU 14th Spetsnaz Brigade. If the battle had stopped after the initial failure of the first couple of days, it still would have been a setback for the Russian Federation. But the battle didn't stop after just the first few days. Having started in January, assaults would continue well into February, often leading to bizarre footage of advances by small groups of vehicles that had no feasible chance of success. We have plenty of video of individual tank platoons or small groups of vehicles moving up to locations where vehicles still lie wrecked, having hit mines, manoeuvring round them, and hitting mines. The image on the bottom right there is taken seconds before a lone Russian armoured vehicle attempts to manoeuvre through the destroyed wreckages of several vehicles before it and hits a mine just like they did. To an outside observer looking at drone footage, they look awfully like some of the Russian lemming attacks of the early war. Small units receiving orders to do the impossible and driving directly to their inevitable destruction. And as the losses mounted, the information space became a mess of allegations and competing reports. Alexander Khodakovsky complained that one of the reasons the offensive was so unsuccessful is because Wagner essentially had been hoarding all the ammunition, and that units attacking Vuhledar only had what they needed for the first day of the offensive, which does beg the question, if that was the case, why the offensive continued for literal weeks. The Ukrainians claimed that some Russian units refused to advance after seeing what happened to those went before them, while social media posts came out suggesting frustration in some Russian units that their casualties weren't being fully acknowledged. Given the number of vehicles involved and lost, some in the media took to calling Vuhledar the greatest tank battle of the war so far, to which one commentator quite rightly noted that this was tanks and armoured vehicles driving into mines and being destroyed by artillery, hardly a great tank battle. This satellite image was released by a reserve Ukrainian officer on Twitter, whose profile I'll link in the description. Dated 3rd February, it shows the results of the initial attack quite well. To the west, you can see where the main original offensive went in. The eastern dachas and the southern dachas are those clusters of small houses that were taken and then shelled heavily. If you go back a few slides, you'll be able to see that U-shape of artillery fire on the western side of this image reflected in that photograph. Basically, Vuhledar itself is just off to the left-hand side of this image. Then to the right, you can see the various parallel roads that other Russian attacks attempted to follow. And along those roads, you can see black clusters of multiple artillery impacts. A number of those mark the locations where a group of vehicles was forced to stop either by mines or by ATGM hits and was then hit by concentrated, accurate Ukrainian artillery. Taken together, it was a series of offensives that achieved very little other than the minor expenditure of Ukrainian ammunition, the loss of a significant number of armoured vehicles, and some of their valuable crews. But what is perhaps most significant potentially for the way the war goes from now is what happened afterwards. The Russian system responded to this unmitigated failure the only way it could, by promoting the one responsible, General Rustam Muradov. Sergei Shoigu would follow this up by visiting the area himself, allowing himself to be photographed and filmed with Muradov. And they met, I would note, if you look at that image in the bottom right there, with an image taken from the War Thunder advertisement, "Victory is ours," repurposed as Russian military propaganda. More Russian reinforcements would be brought into the area, and there was talk of either reconstituting the 155th or merging it with another brigade to help bring it back up to strength. And last week, the Institute for the Study of War suggested the Russian forces, quote, may be preparing to resume offensive operations around Vuhledar, although it's not clear what will have changed to indicate that they should expect anything like a different result. In short, if Bakhmut showed Russia at its most dangerous and put Ukraine in a painful situation, Vuhledar was an image of the Russian military at its worst: sacrificial, inflexible, and prone to responding to failure with recognition and reward. This isn't just a military culture prone to handing out the equivalent of participation trophies. I have to imagine this is an army that would give the gold medal to the bloke who comes last, as long as he happens to be politically reliable. And the result was a one-sided battle that expended Russian offensive potential for very little gain. As analyst Michael Kaufman put it, Ukraine needs a lot more Vuhledars and fewer Bakhmuts. But with that overview of some of the battles complete, what are some of the observations we might be able to take away from them, bearing in mind the inherent uncertainty involved in this exercise? The first thing I'll say is that I'm going to be a complete killjoy and remind you that we need to be careful with our observations and our anecdotes. It's dangerous to look at one report or a small collection of anecdotes from one or two locations and generalize those for the entire front or even for an entire battle. What is true for a unit fighting in one part of Bakhmut may bear very little resemblance to the experience of another Ukrainian unit fighting elsewhere. It's also dangerous to read a report without backtracing it to establish its provenance, but also to check whether or not it's being used correctly. I've seen this happen a number of times with casualty reports. A number of times now I've seen journalists publish articles saying that a certain number of Ukrainians or Russians have been killed in the fighting, either in general or in a particular area. And as their source, they credit some official release. You trace it back to that original release and you find that the source wasn't referring to people who had died, but instead to casualties, killed and wounded. Given there are often many men wounded for every one killed, that's a significant difference. But now the incorrect figure has been published, it's out there on the internet, and you can bet it will be referenced and pointed to by half of social media before the sun goes down. And to take perhaps the most bizarre example I have seen recently, we are going to take a minute and we are going to talk about the shovels thing. Starting in early March, there are a proliferation of articles across the internet, including in some pretty large publications, saying that the Russians are so short on ammo that they are sending their troops into attacks to use shovels. The suggestion was that things were so desperate that Private Conscriptovich now wasn't going to get a gun, he was going to get an entrenching tool and charge into Ukrainian trenches with it. As for Sergeant Besepsky, given his muscle mass, he'd probably wield two at once. Around the same time, there's another story saying that Russians are being sent into battle armed with sticks, but let's just stick to the shovel thing for the moment. Somehow this story makes its way all around the internet, memes are made, and despite the fact that in all the images of Russian troops that we see, they seem to have guns, that is seemingly quickly forgotten because the UK MOD apparently said that they were being sent into battle with shovels. Then pro-Russian sources started to make fun of the whole thing, and every time they gained a couple of meters around Bakhmut, they'd start to joke, wow, how on earth are we going forward armed only with shovels? In short, the whole thing was a little bit bizarre, and you're left asking the question, why on earth would the UK Ministry of Defence, which was always placed as the source in these articles, say that Russian troops were having to attack the enemy armed only with shovels? And I'm sorry to burst everyone's bubble, but the answer is they didn't. The actual UK MOD release takes about 45 seconds to read. It reports that some Russian mobilized reservists describe being ordered to assault Ukrainian strongpoints armed only with, quote, firearms and shovels. There is no mention in that paragraph of a lack of ammunition. That instead comes in the third paragraph, which suggests that close combat is becoming increasingly frequent in Ukraine because of the increased use of dismounted infantry assaults with comparatively less artillery support than in the past, because the Russian artillery was shorter on munitions. So this isn't some enemy at the gate scenario where there aren't enough guns and small arms ammunition to go around. It's saying that as artillery ammunition becomes a concern, the Russians are less likely to just pulverize each defensive position with artillery and instead to send infantry forward to seize those positions, which in some cases may involve close-range combat, using a soldier's personal equipment. So Conscriptovich doesn't just have an entrenching tool, he's got an AK as well. And I don't know about you, but I feel like not mentioning the assault rifle is a pretty glaring omission. If I call the police and tell them a bloke with a shovel is threatening people, they're probably just going to send an ordinary patrol car. And if they turn up and he opens fire using the assault rifle that I forgot to mention because I was so focused on the shovel, they're going to be kind of pissed. In short, make sure you trace your sources because publications aren't always going to do it for you. Another example of something that's not false reporting but instead potentially the wrong message is the reporting of ammunition shortages in the Russian armed forces. These days it seems like every unit in the Russian army is posting messages on social media complaining of a shortage of ammunition. Prigozhin says he's not getting enough, which is why he hasn't captured Bakhmut yet, and everyone else says Prigozhin is getting too much, which is why they don't have enough, which is why they're not succeeding in their objectives. I've got a screenshot there of a video by members of the 136th Brigade who are going to Vuhledar to help replace the 155th, basically saying that all the ammunition supply is going to Bakhmut and PMC Wagner. And yet, despite all of these complaints, the Russian guns keep firing. They maintain artillery superiority over Ukraine in many areas of the front. They continue to be able to grind out advances, leveraging artillery superiority. So what is happening? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, those shortages could be localized, and units could have figured out that making a video complaining about ammo is a great way to get more. For all the units making videos, there are other units that aren't. Secondly, the perception of what is enough could be very different. Russian units are used to a certain level of supply. They're used to being able to simply level everything in front of them and totally outmatching the Ukrainians in artillery ammunition. So what the Ukrainians might perceive as having a lot of ammo, many Russian units might perceive as a major ammunition shortage. Finally, I'll make the note that throughout history, you almost always see troops and commanders complain of a lack of materiel, with ammunition being one of the favourites. Just like a craftsman blaming their tools, commanders throughout history will often complain that the reason they cannot go faster or further or achieve more is because they simply don't have enough stuff. To make that excuse doesn't mean blaming the men under your command. It has nothing to do with your own personal competence, it's simply a factor beyond your control. And so while I think these sort of videos coupled with other evidence suggest that Russia is increasingly supply constrained when it comes to artillery ammunition, I'd be nervous extrapolating this out to suggest that Russian units are about to run out entirely anytime soon. Alright, so if that's some of the stuff that we can't take away from it, what about observations we can make? And I'm going to start with something very basic that I've talked about before. The Russian winter offensive seems to show that attacking fortified positions is extremely difficult. And I know that's going to sound obvious to a great number of people listening, but as a factor it appears to have been underestimated enough to bear repeating. Some Russian commentators have described this problem in quite colourful terms. Strelkov refers to bashing one's forehead against fortified positions, or exterminating the last of one's assault infantry with frontal assaults. Places like Avdiivka demonstrate that a heavily fortified position with determined defenders, some artillery support, and some ATGMs are incredibly difficult to displace. In the near term, this helps to explain some of the difficulty that Russian attacks have faced, as well as some of the tactical changes and innovations we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's also important to remember that eventually this problem is going to be reversed. It's going to be Ukraine that has to be the one launching an offensive. They're going to have to be the ones moving through minefields, clearing trenches, and destroying bunkers. And I think expectations, both of what material Ukraine requires and what we can expect of a Ukrainian counterattack, should be measured against this problem. Because Russian defences are in much better condition now than they were in Kharkiv in 2022. But at the same time, I'd also make a low to medium confidence observation based on the comments by fighters of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion and videos of Ukrainian and Russian fighting position that there's room to significantly improve the entrenchment of many of these units. A lot of the trenches we see are very basic. They lack some of the features that became common to these sort of entrenchments as far back as World War I. Deeper shelters from artillery fire, overhead cover, firing steps, drainage, and grenade sumps. Many casualties being taken are by individuals who are in trenches being hit by artillery fire. And indeed, one of the more common complaints I've read is of troops being sent to man positions, particularly trenches, that are known to enemy artillery and will simply be shelled again with no way to respond themselves. It may be that in some scenarios, more flexible defensive tactics coupled with better built fortifications might reduce casualties, though I suspect the applicability and viability of that recommendation is going to vary greatly battlefield to battlefield. If you're already defending the basement beneath an industrial complex, you probably don't want to go outside and dig a slightly better trench. I'd also suggest there are some systems which have stood out in recent engagements. I'm aware that material doesn't answer all military questions, but the supply of material is one of those factors over which the West has the greatest control, so it's worth calling out. Whether you're talking about Vuhledar or the fighting in Luhansk or elsewhere, landmines have been absolutely critical. They limit the viable avenues of approach for an attacking force, they demand an opponent apply specialised equipment, and they inflict attrition for relatively low cost. One addenda to this that showed itself at Vuhledar reportedly was the artillery deployed mine. These have been supplied in relatively small numbers to the Ukrainians by Western powers, and they're basically mines that can be deployed by artillery shell. There are also versions that we've seen Russia using that can be deployed by rockets. And the advantage of these systems is they can be laid without putting personnel in danger, so even if an area is demined, it can be remined using one's own artillery. One wonders whether more of these systems might be requested by the Ukrainians, as might cluster munitions. Because as we saw at Vuhledar, a properly shaped battlefield can cause enemy armour to cluster up. And a cluster of enemy vehicles like that would be extremely vulnerable to just a few rounds of DPICM. Other systems of note have appeared before but deserve further mention here. Drones continue to be vital. They enable everything: reconnaissance, attack, and defence. Meanwhile, precision-guided shells and guided rockets for the M270 and the HIMARS system also continue to prove their worth. There are some anecdotes of situations where these systems fail or are intercepted, but there's a combination of video evidence and also statements by some Ukrainian officers that suggest they have a very significant impact. And given Ukraine's challenges with artillery ammunition supply, there might be room for precision to be leveraged to replace mass. But a major observation I want to pick up either next week or the week after is the issue of changing force quality. And I've talked about this before with the idea that you might see an army devolve over time. Many of Ukraine and Russia's best pre-war troops, NCOs and junior officers have been killed or wounded at this point. And even where they haven't, the overall size of the armies involved has greatly expanded. That means you have a lot more mobilised personnel. You have troops with limited military experience. And you've got officers who are either new to the job or who are reserve officers being pulled back with their last military service being potentially decades in the past. That means over time, the technical competence on average of your units, all else being equal, if you don't aggressively train, capture lessons, and hold that quality together, is going to decline. The 155th was an elite Russian formation, but by the time of Vuhledar, there's an awful lot of mobilized personnel in its ranks, and in some of the video evidence, it shows. A freshly mobilized tank crew might be more likely to panic or simply not know what to do when faced with an unfortunate tactical conundrum like the vehicle in front of them suddenly exploding. On the Ukrainian side, this manifests in terms of stories of troops with really little training being pushed into places like Bakhmut to fill gaps in a hurry. On the Russian side, we see some quite extreme cannibalization, with troops putting up videos saying that they have been trained extensively as artillerymen, but they're being pushed into service as assault infantrymen because that's what the army needs in the here and now. And the result is particularly some Russian units that might have had the capacity to do complex maneuver at the first stages of the invasion in February 2022 may no longer have a critical mass of personnel with the skill necessary for more complex operations. And that may have wide-ranging implications for both sides going forward. But even though we've seen forces that are increasingly made up of newly mobilized personnel, fresh volunteers, or indeed men pulled directly from the Russian prison system, that doesn't mean we haven't seen examples of evolving tactics and organization. That process might be partly helped by the fact that even within the same armies, not all units employ the same tactics and organization. Russian naval infantry don't fight in the same way as the Wagner PMC, and where one approach proves more successful than others, the rest of the force may look to emulate it, for better or occasionally for worse. For example, a reserve Ukrainian officer recently started posting excerpts from a Russian field manual that included a description on the organization and tactics for assault units. These units and their tactics may partly have been inspired by the way that Wagner assault units fought at Bakhmut, and in both their organization and their tactics represent, I would argue, a further move away from the pre-war Russian BTG and its accompanying ideas. Based on the material that's been published, these assault or storm units can be either permanent formations that are trained for the role or temporary formations that are pulled together to try and solve a tactical objective. If it's a permanent force, then an assault company might be specifically trained in the assault role, or it might be a group of raw recruits who barely know one end of an AK from another. The common configurations vary unit to unit. There doesn't seem to be any uniform design. But one thing that does stand out in the examples posted is that compared to ordinary pre-war Russian organization, the units seem smaller and also much less heavy. Organic logistics is reduced, organic MLRS at the battalion level seems to have been removed, and by Western standards, the platoons and the companies are tiny, platoons of 12 to 15 personnel operating in three-man sections, and a reduced IFV component, which means some of the infantry are either going to be riding on the tanks or IFVs or operating entirely dismounted. I'll link some of the threads on this structure in the description for those who are interested, and I'll also say I'm not the right person to judge whether this new system makes sense or not. But I'll note it appears to at least be an attempt to adapt both to challenging battlefield circumstances and potentially to increasing material shortages. Taken together, it's an interesting evolution of the Russian force structure. Assault units that incorporate ideas that wouldn't be unfamiliar to some of those who fought in World War II or even in World War I. While at the higher levels of organization, the Russian army looks more and more Soviet with every month that passes. You don't hear people talk much about the lean, mean battalion tactical groups of the pre-war period anymore. Instead, as Viktor Kevliuk put it, the Russian army is increasingly rolling back to the cannons of the 1980s. I presume he's talking figuratively there when he says cannons, because if he was talking literally, then 1950s or even 1940s would be a more accurate description in some cases. Likewise, we're also seeing the Ukrainians try to take lessons from the experience through the Russian winter offensive. And what I bring together on this slide is a complex composite of commentary by Western observers who have gone to Ukraine, things that have been published in the Ukrainian media, and things that have come out of interviews with Ukrainian officers by various forms of media. Michael Kaufman, for example, asserts that there's a bit of a culture clash in parts of the Ukrainian military, that the culture at the more junior level, from say the battalion down, tends to be more flexible, built on ideas that would be familiar to Western militaries like Mission Command, where units aren't told exactly how to accomplish something, they're told what the commander wants to achieve and told to go do it. You don't tell a squad of Marines how to take a hill, you tell them you want the hill and then turn away so you don't have to watch the acts of violence that follow. But mobilization means that a lot of the officers in the Ukrainian military, particularly higher levels, are going to be reserve officers whose last experience may be decades out of date. They may represent an older, more Soviet way of doing things, one which clashes with the flexibility that allows the Ukrainian military to perform at its very best, taking advantage of the initiative and motivation of troops at the front. Then there's a grab bag of other reforms and issues that are being talked about. The need to give units flexibility in choosing their defensive positions so they're not sent to occupy positions that are already zoned by Russian artillery. The need to devolve ISR assets like drones down to relatively low levels like companies or platoons, rather than hoard them at battalion level. Even though it's got nothing to do with the fighting itself, some have called out the need for ongoing bureaucratic reform. The Ukrainian military is still largely paper-based. A lot of things require signatures, physical signatures, a problem which absolutely pervades the Russian military as well. So even though it's got nothing to do with making things go boom, a little bit of organisational reform, digitisation or flexibility might help things move quickly. Then there's questions around force employment, how specific units are utilised. The example given is the temptation for commanders to use special forces as elite infantry. Because when the going gets tough, yes, special forces units will perform pretty well in the light infantry role, but it's usually not the most valuable job that they could be doing. And then finally, there are training and equipment issues. The Ukrainian military is much larger than it was at the start of the war, but the pool of vehicles hasn't increased to match. There are many mechanised formations that aren't truly fully mechanised. That's not a problem fighting as dismounted infantry defending some of these static locations. But if they're going to be mobile and go on the offensive and truly act as mechanised infantry, they're going to need a lot more than 100 Bradleys, or whatever other IFE the West can pull together. Add to that requests for more mortars for fire support at a local level, and a request for accelerated training efforts, and you've got a pretty long list of identified potential improvements. And I'm aware that that long list might make it sound like the Ukrainian military must be barely functional. Obviously, nothing could be further from the truth. The Ukrainian military has consistently outperformed its Russian opponent, vehicle for vehicle and man for man. But nothing is gained by pretending that this is a perfect force. And the ability of the Ukrainian military and media to have discussions around potential improvements may be one of the bigger advantages it enjoys over the Russian military. The Russian army did take some lessons from its experience in 2022. It'll be interesting to see how effectively Ukraine harvests the lessons of the Russian winter offensive. But with that said, it's time to get back to the offensive itself. What has it achieved and what does it mean for the war to come? In terms of the final territorial gains achieved, those still remain somewhat contingent. In territorial terms so far, Russian gains have been, well, minuscule. If any of the major objectives, like Bakhmut or Avdiivka, fall, then some of the territory behind them will likely fall as well. But I'd be careful of stretching that idea too far. It's incredibly unlikely that the fall of somewhere like Bakhmut would lead to the complete collapse of the Ukrainian front. Instead, as with the fall of places like Donetsk and Lysychansk before, the most likely outcome is simply a fallback to the next defensive line. And so far, the Russian offensive hasn't achieved even that. Now, obviously on social media, you'll find every opinion from this was a crushing Russian victory to Ukraine will be in Moscow by next week. But while the offensive is still obviously ongoing, I'd point out that most commentary, Russian and Western, has not been kind to the outcomes of this operation. Strelkov put it pretty bluntly, saying that during the winter campaign, the Russian Federation Armed Forces failed to achieve any successes beyond the purely tactical. Prigozhin now says he thinks it'll take at least 18 months to seize the Donbass, while the Russian military correspondent is saying that new defense lines have already now been built behind Avdiivka and Marinka. I don't think that it is possible to bring the enemy's front line down there. Russian state media has begun warning of potential Ukrainian counterattacks, while Western commentators have generally assessed the offensive to have been a folly. Retired General Mick Ryan argued that Russia launched its offensive at a time that was disadvantageous and as a result has favoured Ukraine. Many Ukrainian commentators likewise have viewed the Russian offensive as a mistake, but focus much of their attention on the things that did go wrong on the Ukrainian side. Even though the Russian offensive gained very little territory, the costs for Ukraine have been high, and there will be those pushing for continuous improvement. Although none of that takes away from what the Ukrainian military has achieved, holding the Russian military to such minimal gains for so long. What Russia did achieve, it's clear that it achieved at significant cost. I'll look more at the idea of casualty figures and attrition in the future, but for now it's enough to say that visually confirmed loss ratios for Russia grew again. After the fall of Kherson, the ratio of lost Russian equipment visually confirmed to lost Ukrainian equipment had begun to narrow, and the loss rate of Russian equipment in general had begun to fall. Once the offensive began, that ratio began to widen once again. Then there are the many reports of truly horrific human casualties on the Russian side. Not just among the prisoners of Wagner Group, but among other Russian units as well. After all, Wagner wasn't fighting at Vuhledar, Wagner wasn't fighting in Luhansk, Wagner weren't the ones doing the fighting at Avdiivka, and those losses have consequences for the quality of the force. But even if those casualty figures are debated, the expenditure of material like ammunition and barrels are less so. The Russian MOD proudly puts out material talking about how much ammunition it is providing. Pro-Russian commentators talk about Russia's artillery advantage and how many tens of thousands of rounds they're firing all the time. But unless the Russian military has discovered magic, ammunition that it fires now is ammunition that isn't going to be available later on. And as I'll talk about in a moment, that might have implications for the odds of successful Ukrainian counterattacks. On the other side, I would argue there is one area in which the Russian winter campaign has probably been reasonably successful. Despite hitting the military equivalent of a brick wall, the Russian offensive has had an outsized impact, I would suggest, on the information space. Remember, when this started, Ukraine was coming off the high of the Kherson liberation. The news coverage was about the territory that Ukraine had taken back. If Russia had sat on the defensive, then the story would have been about Ukraine's slow incremental advances towards places like Kreminna. Instead, for the last several months, the news stories have overwhelmingly been about, Bakhmut. Whether you're talking about YouTube, social media, major media, news programs, you see words like breakthroughs and advances being used to describe gains that might be measured in hundreds of meters. And because of the nature of the 24-hour news cycle, where war needs to change every 24 hours despite the fact that war seldom changes significantly every 24 hours, any development, no matter how small, can become a headline. And that in turn might have implications for the sort of support that Ukraine receives. To move into something that's just personal view for a moment, I also feel like the public expectations of the Russian military and what we believe constitutes winning has changed over time. In early 2022, the failure of the Russians to take the Ukrainian capital was a critical failure, a crushing defeat. Now the capture of a fraction of a percent of Ukraine's territory at the cost of asymmetric losses, well, that's not a Russian catastrophe, that's a heralded Russian advance. Proof that anyone can ace the performance evaluation if you just set the bar low enough. As for what this offensive means for Ukraine, I think the answer is it's complicated. A number of Ukrainian units and their ammunition reserves have been badly strained by the need to resist the Russian offensive, that much is clear. Bakhmut is a meat grinder and it has sucked in manpower and material. But at the same time, many of the Ukrainian brigades that we know are being re-equipped or assembled for coming counter-offensive work were not committed, as far as we can tell, to any of these actions. Several quality Ukrainian units were badly stressed, but it does appear the Ukrainian High Command has made difficult decisions to husband personnel and resources for the spring and summer. And so I'll make the argument that despite the pain, despite the casualties, despite the losses, despite everything that places like Bakhmut have come to represent, the Russian offensive was probably a major gift to the Ukrainians. And to understand that argument, we need to go back to 2022, where after the disaster around Kyiv and the retreat from the north of the country, the Russians poured immense amounts of artillery ammunition in particular, but also manpower and material into taking places like Donetsk and Lysychansk. Russian ammunition and material expenditures then help explain some of the shortages we began to see later, while losses of personnel in the early war and those kinds of actions helped set the conditions for later Ukrainian counteroffensives at places like Kharkiv. The Russian army essentially wore itself down on the offensive, making itself vulnerable to the counterpunch. Now, I'm not suggesting a Kharkiv experience will be repeated. The Russians have subsequently mobilized new personnel, they've dug in and entrenched defensive positions. The conditions are not quite as ripe for a push as they were in September of 2022. But in these efforts, Russia has thrown away, just in the last 2 months, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery ammunition. And as I'll explore more in the future, it's worn down some quite capable formations, the airborne, the marine infantry, the Wagner assault units. And those are all now units that won't be available either to launch an offensive during the better weather of spring or summer or to answer a Ukrainian counteroffensive. There are no guarantees of results when it comes to upcoming Ukrainian counterattacks. It's clear the task in front of them is incredibly difficult, but to the greatest extent possible, I'd argue that Russia has made that job easier by launching premature and costly offensives, potentially motivated by political objectives that involve the asymmetric expenditure of resources for very limited gains. To have the best possible chances for success, Ukraine is going to need more help from the West. In particular, they are going to need every single bloody artillery shell that can be found, along with air defense ammunition and more armoured vehicles. But as painful as it's been, I'd argue they have at least received some help from the Russians in setting the conditions and making sure the Ukrainian army has the best possible shot. But that criticism presumes there was legitimately an alternative for the Russians, that Surovikin strategy of holding on the defensive, absorbing the Ukrainian counterattack, and then going on the offensive again was ever viable to begin with. From a military perspective, it might have made sense. All of the resources that Russia has expended in launching attacks against places like Bakhmut could have been held in reserve and thrown in against any Ukrainian counteroffensive. But the problem is that war is ultimately a political act. If Russian leadership feel that victories are required for international opinion, for domestic consumption, or just to take the Donbass as Putin requires, then optimal military strategy doesn't really have much to say about it. Those advocating for a defensive strategy in Russia may well have been right, at least in a purely military sense. It's a hypothetical we'll probably never know. But in a political sense, it may have been that a defensive strategy simply didn't meet the requirements of the government, which meant the troops would have to go forward, no matter the cost. Now, as spring begins to arrive, one of the biggest determinants of success is going to be how well the forces recover from the attrition that they've suffered. The winter campaign has been very expensive in terms of manpower and materiel for both sides. Ukraine may have lost less, but it also has a lot less to lose. Both armies are now going to be suffering from a degree of exhaustion, and it's a race to see which can pick itself up faster and prepare for the battles that are coming. It's a situation where I'd argue the race to generate or regenerate combat power is probably a lot more important than the movement of the lines on the map. It's the grim business of building up capability even when casualties are suffered and material is consumed. And it's a happy topic I'll be picking up in the near future to close out this little mini-series on the winter campaign. In conclusion, Russia appears to have swapped from a largely defensive to an offensive strategy mid-winter, launching a major offensive far earlier than many external analysts had expected. The initial stage of the offensive likely aimed to take a number of Ukrainian settlements close to the line of contact. And as at time of recording, while some of them may be threatened, and while casualties have in places been very heavy, none of the primary objectives have yet fallen. The winter has in places been very painful for the Ukrainian army. The losses around places like Bakhmut have been painful, and there are potential lessons in terms of tactics, organisation, or equipment that may be worth exploring. But the heroism of the Ukrainian defenders has been beyond reproach, and in strategic terms I'd argue that the Russian offensive has been a major folly, exhausting formations, expending resources, and ultimately achieving very little. What happens next is still highly uncertain. If Ukrainian forces plan to counterattack, then they face a far more difficult challenge than they did several times last year. But all else being equal, the Russian offensive has likely improved the odds of future Ukrainian offensives. The Russian 2022 campaigns repeatedly suffered from over-ambitious offensive operations, exhausting the Russian military and setting conditions for Ukrainian counterstrikes. Only time will tell whether the same can ultimately be said for the Russian winter offensive of January-February 2023. A brief channel update to close out. I'm aware that videos on trench warfare and attrition don't lend themselves to jokes and levity in the same way as some other topics, but I hope you found this video useful regardless, labouring as it is under very difficult information conditions. I also hope you can understand why I decided to take most of the discussion around casualty estimates, attrition, and force regeneration out of this episode to focus on the larger picture. Those sort of figures are often particularly contentious, and I think they deserve their own coverage. Speaking of other topics, I've also received a lot of requests and seen a lot of comments asking me to cover the AUKUS developments. And I thought I'd say this here just because I don't want anyone, for example, joining the Patreon on the assumption that they can vote for that particular topic. I won't be doing any content on AUKUS or Australia's future submarine fleet. But not to fear, there are plenty of countries out in the world not called Australia that I am very happy to talk about. A particularly special thanks to those who contributed directly to this video, particularly those of you in Ukraine. And a broader thanks, as always, to those of you watching and supporting the channel. Please allow me to wish you all the best, and I'll see you all again next week.